In Geneva, the air was heavy with anticipation. Journalists gathered, cameras clicked, and reporters leaned forward as Mariana Katzarova, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Russian Federation, walked to the podium. Her presence was not just symbolic. It was a statement that the international community was still watching, still documenting, and still demanding accountability from one of the world's most powerful yet most secretive states. Katzarova began by reminding those in the room that this was not her first report. For 3 years, she had monitored the Russian Federation, tracing a pattern of behavior, documenting testimony, and listening to voices smuggled out from inside prison walls. And yet, she confessed that each passing year, the situation grew worse, not better. The repression inside Russia was not slowing down, it was escalating. Then came her first striking declaration. One of my main findings after 3 years monitoring the Russian Federation, is that unfortunately the repression inside Russia is escalating. The words landed like a gavel. Escalation was not what anyone had hoped to hear, but it was precisely what the evidence revealed. Since Moscow launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the Russian state had expanded its domestic machinery of control. What had once been targeted harassment of political opponents had evolved into a blanket of intimidation covering almost every layer of society. Katzarova did not hold back. Russia is now run through a state-sponsored system of fear and punishment where dissent is erased and civic space dismantled, and still the remnants of civil society and independent media are being persecuted, prosecuted, and imprisoned. Here was the heart of her report. Russia was not simply facing random abuses or local injustices. Instead, it was operating a deliberate state-sponsored system designed to make fear itself a form of governance. Civil society, once vibrant in Russia, had been reduced to fragments. Independent media outlets, once loud and persistent, were shuttered or forced into exile. Those who continued to speak faced criminal charges, confiscated assets, and years behind bars. The rapporteur described a landscape in which courage had become a crime. She explained, human rights defenders, journalists, lawyers, and political opponents are systematically prosecuted, tortured, and silenced. Anti-war dissenters and activists are serving years in prison, not for crimes, but for courage. Courage. Nothing more, nothing less. And yet, in today's Russia, courage was enough to trigger punishment. The very act of opposing war, or even questioning official policy, was reclassified as treachery. The report then turned to the most harrowing part of her findings, the treatment of Ukrainian detainees in Russian custody. Her voice hardened as she spoke. Ukrainian detainees are being starved, tortured with electric shocks, raped and even tortured by doctors and medical personnel. At least 206 Ukrainian prisoners of war have died in Russian captivity, their bodies showing signs of torture. These were not just statistics. Each number represented a life extinguished, a family shattered. The allegation that medical personnel themselves participated in abuse was especially chilling. Doctors are meant to heal, to preserve dignity, to protect the vulnerable. Instead, in some of these cases, they became agents of cruelty, weaponizing their skills against the very people they were sworn to treat. Katzarova admitted she was shocked by the direction the Russian state had taken. I think it dramatically changes every day. I mean, I'm shocked because I thought, well, now they dismantled the civil society, torture as usual, impunity as usual. Where else could you go from here? Clearly, they haven't reached the rock bottom yet in the repression at home and the imaginative tools on the occupied territories, enduring the war against Ukraine, against civilians and, POWs. Her words painted a grim picture. Repression was not static, but dynamic. The state continued to find new tools, new methods, new ways to exert control. Rock bottom had not yet been reached. As her report unfolded, a broader picture emerged. The crackdown inside Russia had accelerated after the Ukraine war began. Laws that once seemed obscure, such as the notorious foreign agents legislation became blunt instruments of suppression. Independent NGOs, even those providing humanitarian assistance, were forced to register as agents of hostile powers. Journalists found their offices raided, their websites blocked, their bank accounts frozen. And ordinary Russians who once believed they could avoid politics by remaining silent now found that silence itself was insufficient. Even private conversations could be reported, leading to investigations and arrests. Protests became almost impossible. Anti-war demonstrations were crushed within minutes, often before banners were even raised. Police units stationed at central squares scanned faces, tracked movements, and carried out arrests preemptively. Those who dared to defy these measures faced swift trials and heavy sentences. Mothers holding placards reading simply "No war" were dragged away before the eyes of their children. Students distributing leaflets calling for peace were expelled, branded as extremists. The system was relentless, but it was not confined to Russian citizens alone. In occupied Ukrainian territories, repression took on even darker forms. Civilians were subjected to intimidation, forced displacement, and in some cases, violence aimed at breaking any resistance to Russian control. Teachers were pressured to rewrite curriculums, inserting pro-Russian propaganda into school lessons. Local officials were coerced into swearing loyalty oaths. Those who refused often disappeared without explanation. The allegations of torture against Ukrainian prisoners were perhaps the most damning. Reports described electric shocks applied during interrogations, prisoners kept without food for days, and assaults designed to destroy both body and spirit. In some cases, families received the bodies of their loved ones showing unmistakable signs of abuse, bruises, burns, broken bones. These details, Katzarova warned, could amount to war crimes under international law. For Russians who attempted to fight back through legal means, the outlook was equally bleak. Lawyers representing political prisoners faced harassment, surveillance, and sometimes disbarment. Courtrooms no longer offered justice, but instead served as stages for political theatre, where verdicts were predetermined and sentences severe. Even within prisons, lawyers reported being denied access to their clients, a violation of basic rights. Meanwhile, state-controlled media flooded airwaves with narratives of patriotism, loyalty, and obedience. Dissenters were branded as traitors, as Western agents intent on destroying Russia from within. School children were indoctrinated with wartime propaganda, taught songs glorifying sacrifice and obedience. The goal was clear: to build a society in which questioning authority was unthinkable. For the international community, these findings create difficult choices. Western governments may respond with calls for new sanctions or increased support for international investigations. Human rights organizations may push harder for accountability, demanding that those responsible for torture and repression face justice. Yet, as Katzarova warned, time is not on the side of victims. Each day that passes means more arrests, more trials, more suffering. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of her testimony was not what had already happened, but what may still lie ahead. If rock bottom has not been reached, then the repression has further depths to explore. The tools of fear can still be sharpened, the punishments made harsher, the silencing more absolute. That prospect is what left the room silent after her final words. In closing, Katzarova's message was clear. The world cannot look away. Russia is not simply experiencing a period of authoritarian drift. It is actively constructing a system of governance rooted in fear and punishment. For those inside the country, speaking truth may cost them their freedom. For Ukrainians under Russian control, it may cost them their lives. And so this report stands not just as a collection of statistics and testimonies, but as a plea for recognition, a plea for accountability, and above all, a plea for action. Behind every number is a human story. A journalist silenced, a lawyer imprisoned, a family grieving the loss of a son or daughter who dared to dissent. Behind every finding is a voice that risked everything to be heard. From Geneva, the echo of those voices carries far beyond the press room. It calls on the world to remember, to act, and to refuse silence. For if fear is allowed to govern unchecked, the cost will not only be borne by Russia and Ukraine, but by the very principles of human dignity and freedom that bind us all.
I wanted to ask you about the medical personnel who are taking part and condoning torture according to your yeah. Thank you. Nina Larson with AFP.
The International Committee of the Red Cross. I think this point is extremely important. The release of the Russian political prisoners who are in prison for the only crime. Similarly, all Russian police. One of my main findings after third year, after 3 years monitoring the Russian Federation, is that unfortunately the repression inside Russia is escalating. Russia is now run through a state-sponsored system of fear and punishment, where dissent is erased and civic space dismantled. And still, the remnants of civil society and independent media are being persecuted, prosecuted, and imprisoned. Human rights defenders, journalists, lawyers, and political opponents are systematically prosecuted, tortured, and silenced. Anti-war dissenters and activists are serving years in prison, not for crimes, but for courage. Ukrainian detainees are being starved, tortured with electric shocks, raped, and even tortured by doctors and medical personnel. At least 206 Ukrainian prisoners of war have died in Russian captivity, their bodies showing signs of torture. I think it dramatically changes every day. I mean, it's really, I'm shocked because I thought, well, now they demolish, they dismantle the civil society, torture as usual, impunity as usual. Where else could you go from here? Clearly, they haven't reached the rock bottom yet in the repression at home and the imaginative tools on the occupied territories and during the war against Ukraine, against civilians and, POWs.